Most Decaf coffee essen Wieger. It's more inconsistent and often more processed than people think. But a few supermarket options actually do a much better job if you know what to look for. Peet's Decaf is one of the easiest places to see that. You'll find it in stores like Kroger, Safeway, and Target. Sometimes even Walmart, usually sitting in that $11 to $15 range. It feels a bit more premium, but still very accessible. A lot of people assume that when a brand has a stronger reputation, the decaf version will be too bold or too heavy, but that's not really what happens here. This stays controlled. It sits in a medium range, not pushed too far and not overly aggressive. And that matters more in decaf than most people realize. When roasting goes to dark, it often hides inconsistency from the decaffeination process. And that's where problems start to show up over time. You end up with a coffee that feels different from one bag to the next. Sometimes smoother, sometimes harsher. And that unpredictability is exactly what most people are trying to avoid. This one doesn't rely on that kind of masking. It stays more stable, more consistent in how it behaves day after day. The flavor doesn't swing wildly. The body stays balanced, and that creates something you can actually build into a routine. You don't have to adjust your expectations every time you open a new bag. You already know what you're getting. And that's what makes it useful. Not perfect, not the most complex coffee out there, but reliable. And in decaf, reliability matters more than anything else, because the whole point is to reduce variables, not add more. Now shift to something much more familiar. Dunkin' Decaf is everywhere. You see it in almost every supermarket, usually priced between $8 and $12. Very accessible, very easy to grab without thinking too much. And because of that, people assume it can be that good, that it's just basic or lower quality. Something you buy only because it's convenient. But that assumption misses the point. What matters here is consistency at scale. Dunkin' is built to deliver the same experience across millions of bags, and that forces a level of control that smaller or more specialty options don't always maintain. It keeps a very stable profile, sitting right in a medium roast range, not too dark, not too sharp, and that balance is what keeps it usable. Decaf already removes part of the natural structure of the coffee, so when roasting becomes too aggressive, things fall apart quickly. You start to notice bitterness, dryness, or just a lack of balance that makes the coffee harder to drink every day. This one avoids that. It stays simple, straightforward, and predictable. The kind of coffee you can make half asleep in the morning without worrying about how it's going to taste. And that's exactly what most people are actually looking for. Even if they don't say it that way. They don't want to think about coffee every day. They want something that works without effort. Something that fits into their routine without creating friction. That's where this kind of option quietly wins. Now, there's something important that most people miss when they start looking for clean coffee, especially in decaf. Organic helps, but it doesn't guarantee zero. That's a detail a lot of channels ignore. But it matters because it changes how you evaluate what you're buying. If you rely only on labels, you're going to overestimate some options and underestimate others. What actually tells you more is how the coffee behaves over time. Does it feel stable? Does it stay consistent from one purchase to the next? Does it avoid extremes that create unnecessary stress on your system? Those are the signals that matter in real life, because they're the ones you experience every day, not the ones printed on the bag. Now think about a brand that carries a completely different expectation. Starbucks. You see it everywhere. In Target, Walmart, and grocery chains across the country, usually in that $10 to $14 range. Most people already have a fixed idea about it being strong, dark, and heavy. And sometimes that's true. That's the reputation they've built over time. But when you look at their decaf options more closely, especially something like Pike Place, the reality is a bit more controlled than people expect. It doesn't push as hard into extremes. It stays closer to a balanced medium profile. And that matters because in decaf, extreme roasting is often used to compensate for lost flavor, which usually creates more problems than it solves. You end up with something that tastes strong but feels inconsistent or even harsh over time. This avoids that approach. It stays more stable across batches, more predictable in daily use. And that predictability is what allows it to fit into a routine without forcing adjustments. You're not constantly reacting to the coffee. It stays within a narrow range, and that makes it easier to trust. When you step back and look at these first options together, a pattern starts to show up very clearly. None of them are trying to impress you with intensity or bold claims. They're not trying to stand out on the shelf with something extreme. They're doing something more important. They stay controlled, they stay consistent, and they avoid the kind of variability that makes decaf frustrating to deal with. Because the goal here is not to find something exciting, it's to find something that works every single day, without friction, without surprises, without forcing you to rethink your choice every time you make a cup. That's what makes a decaf coffee feel clean in a practical sense. Not the marketing, not the label, but the behavior over time. And once you start looking at it this way, the decision becomes much easier. You stop chasing what sounds better, and you start choosing what actually fits your life. And the next ones are where this becomes even clearer. Now think about something you've probably seen but never really paid attention to in this category. Green Mountain Decaf is one of those options that shows up everywhere, especially if you've ever used a Keurig, but it's also easy to find in regular ground coffee at most supermarkets. It usually sits in that $9 to $13 range, so it stays right in that accessible zone. And because it's often labeled as a breakfast blend, a lot of people assume it's going to be too light or too weak, especially for decaf. That's the common reaction. But that's not exactly what's happening here. This sits in a lighter to medium range, but still controlled. It doesn't swing too far into brightness, and it doesn't feel thin in a way that makes the coffee unsatisfying. And that balance matters more than people realize, because very light decaf can feel unstable. The acidity can stand out too much, the flavor can feel inconsistent, and that creates a different kind of problem. You're not dealing with heaviness, you're dealing with unpredictability. This one avoids that. It stays soft, balanced, and easy to drink. The kind of coffee that doesn't demand your attention but quietly fits into your day. And when something behaves like that, it becomes easier to repeat. You don't have to adjust your expectations. You don't have to question it. It just does its job. Now shift to something even more overlooked. 8 O'Clock Decaf is one of those brands people walk past without thinking twice. It's been around for a long time. It's widely available in places like Walmart and Kroger, and it usually sits between $7 and $11. Very affordable, very familiar, and because of that, often underestimated. Most people see the price and immediately assume lower quality, or they expect it to be inconsistent. That's the usual thinking. But what actually matters here is how controlled the roast is. This stays in a medium range, not pushed too dark and not too light, and that balance reduces variability. Because when coffee is pushed into extremes, especially in decaf, it tends to amplify inconsistencies. You start to notice changes from one bag to another, small differences that build up over time and make the experience less reliable. This one avoids that. It stays simple and straightforward, but that simplicity is exactly what makes it useful. The flavor stays within a narrow range, the body feels consistent, and over time that builds trust. You don't buy it expecting something special. You buy it because you know what it's going to give you, and that's often more valuable, especially if you drink coffee every day and don't want to keep adjusting to something new. Now, step back again and look at what these two add to the overall picture. They're not premium, they're not trying to stand out, and they don't rely on strong branding to convince you, but they do something that matters more in daily life. They reduce uncertainty. They stay predictable. And that predictability is what makes decaf actually work long-term, because you're not drinking it once. You're drinking it every day, sometimes more than once a day. And when something behaves differently each time, it creates friction. It forces you to think, to adjust, to question your choice. And over time, that becomes tiring. What these options do is remove that layer of friction. They give you something stable, something that fits into your routine without demanding attention. This is also where a lot of people misunderstand what they should be looking for in decaf. They focus too much on strength or flavor intensity, thinking that stronger means better or more satisfying. But in many cases, stronger just means more roast influence, which can hide inconsistency instead of fixing it. And that's where problems start to show up over time. Bitterness, dryness, a feeling that the coffee isn't quite right but you can't explain why. The better approach is control. A balanced roast, a stable profile, something that stays within a predictable range. That's what makes it easier on your system, and that's what makes it easier to live with every day. And once you start to see that pattern, the decision process changes. You stop looking for the most impressive option, and you start looking for the most reliable one. Something that behaves the same way every time you make it. Something that doesn't force you to rethink your choice. That's what reduces decision fatigue, and that's what makes your routine smoother, without you even noticing it. And the last ones are where this becomes even more obvious. Now think about one of the most familiar names you'll find on any coffee shelf. Folgers Decaf is everywhere. Walmart, Target, small local stores, almost any place that sells coffee, and usually sitting in that $6 to $10 range. It's one of the most accessible options you can find, and because of that, a lot of people dismiss it immediately. Tei asumait es too basic, too low quality. Not something worth considering if you're trying to make a better choice. That's the usual reaction, but this is where it helps to separate perception from behavior. Folgers is built around consistency at scale. It's designed to deliver the same experience over and over again. And in decaf, that kind of control matters more than people think. This sits in a medium to dark range, but it doesn't push into extremes. It stays within a controlled profile, and that's what keeps it usable. Because when decaf is pushed too far into dark roasting, it often becomes harsh, bitter, and inconsistent from one batch to the next. This avoids that. It stays simple, predictable, and easy to work into a daily routine. You're not buying it to be impressed. You're buying it because it behaves the same way every time. And that stability is what makes it useful. Now shift to something that doesn't get as much attention, but fits into this category very well. Community coffee decaf is one of those options that people often overlook, mostly because it doesn't try to stand out. You'll find it in many supermarkets across the U.S., especially in southern regions, but also in larger chains, usually priced between $9 and $13. It doesn't come with strong claims, it doesn't rely on heavy branding, and because of that, it tends to stay under the radar. But what matters here is balance. This sits in a light to medium range, not too bright and not too heavy, and that puts it in what you could call a safe zone. And that safe zone is important, because extreme profiles in decaf tend to create inconsistency. Too light can feel sharp and unstable. Too dark can feel heavy and overwhelming. And both make the coffee harder to live with over time. This avoids that. It stays smooth, controlled, and easy to drink. The kind of coffee that doesn't demand your attention, but quietly fits into your day without creating friction. And when something behaves like that, it becomes easier to trust. You don't question it. You just use it. Now step back one last time and look at everything together. Different brands, different price points, different levels of familiarity, but the same pattern keeps showing up. They avoid extremes. They stay controlled. They deliver a predictable experience. And that's what makes them clean in a practical sense. Not perfect, not flawless, but usable, reliable, and repeatable. Because in real life, that's what actually matters. You're not analyzing coffee every time you make a cup. You're just trying to find something that works without forcing you to think about it. From a health perspective, this is where small differences start to matter more. People usually move to decaf to reduce stimulation, to make coffee easier on their body, especially later in the day. But if the coffee itself is inconsistent, overly roasted, or unstable, that defeats the purpose. You're removing one problem and creating another. What these options do is move in the opposite direction. They reduce variability. They stay within a controlled range. They avoid unnecessary extremes. And that's what makes them easier to live with over time. And this is where the idea of clean coffee becomes much simpler. It's not about chasing something perfect or trying to find the most premium option on the shelf. It's about removing the biggest problems, reducing exposure, reducing inconsistency, reducing the need to guess every time you buy something. That's what these coffees are doing. Some do it better than others. Some feel smoother. Some feel more stable. But they all move in the same direction, and that's what makes them useful. So, instead of standing in front of the shelf trying to figure out what looks better, it makes more sense to focus on what actually behaves better. Look for balance. Look for consistency. Avoid extremes. Ignore the noise. Because once you recognize that pattern, the decision becomes much easier. You stop guessing, you stop overthinking, and you start choosing based on what actually fits your routine. And in the end, that's what this is really about. It's not about perfect coffee. It's about better choices you can repeat. If there's a decaf coffee you keep seeing and you're not sure about, leave it in the comments.